Hey everyone, in this video, we're going to cover a really important part of any Phaser game, the game configuration and the scene system. If you're new to Phaser or Phaser Editor v4, this is a perfect place to start building the foundation for your game. Let's start with the Phaser game configuration. This is where you'll define all of the core settings that Phaser needs to initialize your game. If you take a look at any Phaser example or Phaser game, you'll see they all create an instance of the Phaser game class. This one class can be considered as the heart of your game, and without it, nothing will actually run. If you head over to the official Phaser documentation, there'll be a link in the description down below. You'll find a great breakdown of what this class is, as well as the game configuration and the settings you can provide. And at a high level, your game configuration object allows you to configure various properties on your game instance. Some of the key properties include your game type, so this will define whether Phaser is going to use WebGL or Canvas for your canvas rendering context. Usually we use Phaser Auto, and then Phaser will pick the best option based on your user's device and browser. You can specify your width and height, and so this is how big your canvas element will be, so this will be your game's resolution. This is where you can enable physics for your game. And then you have your scene property, and this is where you can configure which scenes will be used by your game when you create your instance. And so typically you'd only ever have one instance of the Phaser game class at any given time for your game. Now your game instance, this is going to be responsible for a few systems that are global across all of your scenes. This is going to include things like your renderer, and so your canvas rendering context, your animation manager, your game cache. So when you load in files, we can cache them inside Phaser so you can use them throughout all of your scenes. Your data manager registry, input manager for things like your keyboard input or gamepad input, and then other systems like your scene manager and your sound manager. So in Phaser Editor, your game configuration is typically created in a file like main.js or game.js. As an example, in the vanilla JavaScript template, we have this main.js file here. So inside this file here, we're creating a new instance of the phaser.game class, and then when we create our instance, we're providing our game configuration. And so in our example here, we're enabling pixel art, we're setting our width and height for our canvas element, we're targeting auto, and so we'll support WebGL if it's available, or we'll fall back to canvas. And then we're using the scale manager to allow us to dynamically scale our canvas element based on our browser size. In this example here, we're not providing any scenes, but after we create our game instance, we're dynamically adding our scenes to our game configuration. That way Phaser can run them. So depending on the Phaser editor template you choose, the game configuration may have a different setup for what is being used in your template. Alright, now let's talk about scenes. So scenes are like a mini game world where each scene is a self-contained environment. In each scene instance, your scene is going to manage its own input, tweens, the display list of objects to show, the actual game objects, your cameras, and much more. And so a good example is if you have an object in scene A, this is going to be completely isolated from your scene B instance. So in your Phaser game, you'll typically only have one instance of your Phaser game class, but then this class can have one or more scene instances. And so at a high level, what a scene is just a way for you to divide your game into logical sections. A common example would be if you have things like a loading screen, a main menu, a game level, item shop, high score table, a boss fight. These could all be separate scenes in your game, or they could just be one scene. So in your Phaser game instance, you can have as many scenes as you like in a single game, but you'll always at least have one. And so how scenes will differ from your main game instance is your Phaser game instance is going to be your central hub for your game. It's going to be responsible for running your core game loop and using the request animation frame that's going to make your game function. It's going to forward any input from your DOM events to each scene that's currently running. Where if we compare it to a scene, this is going to be its own isolated unit that can do its own thing. And so to see some examples of what this might look like, is in this example here, we have two main Phaser scenes. We have our game scene where we have these boxes that we can interact with and click on them. And then we have this UI scene that's layered on top of our game scene. And all this scene is responsible for doing is displaying the score element and then incrementing our score anytime that value changes. And so this is what's really cool about your scenes in Phaser is your scene manager allows you to run as many scenes as you want, and you can run them in parallel. And so what this allows you to do is you can break up your code into these modular components and then run them when you want through your code. And as the developer, it's completely up to you how you want to structure your game. because we could take all of these game objects and have it in one scene, but by breaking up into 2 smaller scenes, it makes it easier to test and to scale out our game logic. And since we can run multiple scenes at one time, we're also able to layer those scenes and move their ordering of how they're rendered out to our canvas element. So then that way we can control which scene is being rendered on top of the other ones. And so this is really useful for things like our UI or our HUD that we'd always want to display on top of our canvas element. And so just to see another example, we have this main phaser scene here where when we launch these other demos, these are all self-contained scenes that are running different types of logic. And so with our scene manager, we're given full control over how and when our scenes actually start in our game. We're able to start with one scene and then use code to launch other scenes in parallel. We can stop our current scene and transition to another scene. So like if we're on our main menu and we start our game, we could end that scene and then just have our new game scene. We're able to pause a current scene and start another scene at the same time and run that scene. And then when we're done with that scene, we can pause it and switch back over to our other scene and much more. And so just a quick summary of what scenes are. Scenes are just a way for you to divide your game into logical sections, and you can have as many scenes as you want in your single game. Scenes can be stored all in one file, or they can be split across multiple files, and so it's totally up to you for your project, and there's no rule requiring there's only one scene per file. And with Phaser, there's a built-in scene manager, and this is what's responsible for adding and removing your scenes, switching between your scenes, and then update and rendering your scenes in your game. Through the code in your scene manager, you control which scenes are active and in what order they're going to be rendered out. Besides switching between your scenes, you're also able to run multiple scenes at one time, and so this is how we can do things like our UI or our HUD. Finally, with our scene manager, this allows us to do things like start, pause, resume, and sleep our scene instances at any time, which will give you complete control over your game flow. So if you're interested in learning more about scenes and the scene's lifecycle, I recommend taking a look at the Phaser documentation here. There'll be a link in the description of this video. So now that we've reviewed what scenes are, and we have seen some examples of how we can use them in our game, let's jump back over to Phaser Editor. So depending on the Phaser Editor template you have chosen for your project, there is likely a different number of scenes that have already been created. Let's take a look at a few examples. So first, in the vanilla JavaScript project template, if we open up our main.js file, we're going to see that there's 3 scenes included. We have our boot scene, our level scene, and our preload scene. Now how our game is currently configured is in our main.js file. Not only do we create our game instance, we also define our class that represents our boot scene. And in our game configuration, after we create our game instance, we're adding in our Phaser scenes. And we're doing that by referencing our scene manager on our game instance, and then we're using our add method to add in an instance of this scene. So we provide a unique key for our scene, which class or object we want to use, and then if we want to start this scene automatically, once we add this to our scene manager. And so how our boot class is set up, this is going to be responsible for loading any assets that we want to use in our preload scene. And so our preload scene is going to be like our loading screen that will show to the player that will load in all of our assets. And so in this example here, we're loading in our asset that we show in that scene. So we open up our preload scene, we show we have this loading bar with this image here. And so for our image to be available, we need to load that in our boot scene before we start our preload scene. So once we're done with our boot scene, we're then calling our scene manager and calling the start method, which is going to stop our current scene and then start the one we provide here, which will be our preload scene. So then in our preload scene, this will be responsible for loading the rest of our game assets, and then we're showing a progress bar while we load in those assets. Once we're done with that, we then use that start method on our scene manager again to transition over to our level scene. And so our level scene, this would be our main gameplay level where the player interacts with our game elements. So now that we've reviewed the vanilla JavaScript template, we're going to take a look at the TypeScript Vite template. So this template is set up in a similar manner. So if we open up our main.ts file, we have our game configuration, and in that same file, we're defining our class for our boot scene. And now this is going to be structured the same way where we load in our assets for our preload scene, we transition to our preload scene, and then once we go into our preload scene, all we're doing is we're loading in our other assets, and when we're done, we're now jumping over to our level scene, and then our level scene, this would be our main gameplay for our level. Finally, we'll look at one last template, and this is going to be our Vite template. So in our Vite template, if we open up our main.js file, we're going to see our game configurations defined in here. but instead of creating our game instance and adding our scenes after, we're providing them as part of our game configuration. So here we just provide the classes that we want to use, and then Phaser will be responsible for creating those instances and then adding them to our scene manager. So when we add in our scenes this way, by default, Phaser is going to use the first scene that we provide in this array, and it's going to start that scene after it's created that instance. So if we jump over to our boot scene, all we're going to do in here is we're going to load in our assets that we want to use for our preload scene. Now we jump over to our preloader scene. Inside here, we'll load in the rest of our assets that we need for our game, and once we're done, we're going to transition to our main menu. And so our main menu, this would be where our player could choose if they want to start our game, view our options, view the credits, or anything like that. And so once the player clicks on our scene or clicks on one of our buttons, that would be the trigger to transition over to our game scene. So then in our game scene, this is where we'd have our gameplay, and once the player ends the game by winning or if they die, we would now transition to our game over scene. So now that we reviewed a few of the project templates and how they're already set up to support our game configuration and multiple Phaser scenes, we're going to see how we can create a new scene instance and add it to our game. So in this example here, we currently have two scenes. We have our level scene and our preload scene. Our preload scene is responsible for loading all of our assets in our game, and then we transition over to our level scene currently. We're going to add in a new title scene that we're going to display after our preload scene. We're going to transition over to our level scene. So to create a new scene instance, if we come down to our files, let's go into our scenes folder. We're going to right click, let's do new. We're going to do a new scene file. Now for our scene name, we're just going to call this title. We'll do create. So phasereditor will create two new files for us. We're going to have our title.js, which will be our title class that extends our Phaser scene. Then we have our title.scene, where we can actually edit our Phaser scene. Now that we have our new scene instance, we need to tell our game configuration about this. So if we go into our main.js file, I'm going to copy one of our lines of code from here. We'll paste it. We're going to import title from our scenes and then our title.js. And now we need to add that to our configuration. So let's copy this line of code here. We'll paste it. Let's do title. And now we want to reference our class. So now we told Phaser about our new scene. We need to update our other scenes to transition to this scene. So if we open up our preload.js file, we'll see down in our create method, we're transitioning right to our level scene. We're going to update this to go to our title scene. Now to see if our code's working, let's go into our title.js file. In our create method, after we call this editor create, let's add in a console log. So we're just going to do console.log, and we'll say title scene create. Now if we want to test our game, let's click our play button to launch our project in our browser. Now if we open our developer tools and we go into our console, we should see that our game's running, and we'll see our new create method for our title scene was invoked. So now that we have our new scene working, we can now add in like our title image, buttons to start our game, but for the time being, we're just going to transition right over to our level scene. To do that, we'll do this to reference our Phaser scene instance. We're going to do .scene to reference our scene manager. Now we're going to call the start method. And what the start method will allow us to do is we can stop our current scene instance and then start running the scene we provide. And now we'll need to provide our scene name, which we just called level. So now if we do save, let's come back to our browser. All right, so if we refresh our browser, we should see our level scene now being displayed. And in our developer console, we can see our console log line from our title scene. So that's a quick walkthrough of how to set up your Phaser game configuration and how to create and manage scenes in Phaser Editor v4. Scenes help you keep your game organized and flexible. So thanks for watching. If you liked the video, hit the like button and subscribe for more Phaser Editor tutorials, and I'll see you in the next one.